In the autumn of 1909, a church restoration carpenter named Edwin Buller was contracted by the Diocese of Exeter to carry out structural repairs to the nave roof of St. Mary's Church in Ottery St. Mary, Devon, a building that had stood in essentially its current form since the 14th century. Buller was 52 years old and had spent 28 years working on historic church fabric across Devon and Somerset. He had been inside roof spaces that had not been entered since the previous century. He understood old buildings in the way that a man understands them when he has spent 3 decades learning their silences. He ascended to the nave roof space on his 3rd day on site to assess the tie beam condition before ordering timber. He moved along the roof space with his lantern toward the north wall, and at the point where the tie beam met the wall plate, he found something wound around the base of the principal rafter. Wound carefully, not accidentally. Not as a later addition, but as part of the original installation. Copper wire, insulated in a dark waxed cloth that had hardened with age to the consistency of horn. The wire ran from the rafter base along the wall plate to the east, disappearing into the stonework of the north wall, where the plate was bedded. He traced it as far as he could without disturbing the fabric. It entered the wall and did not come out on any face he could access from the roof space. He descended, walked the interior of the church at arcade level, examined every accessible wall face in the north aisle, and found no evidence of the wire emerging anywhere above floor level. He went back up. He traced the wire the other direction, west along the wall plate, until it reached a point above the north door where it descended through a small aperture in the stonework, a channel cut deliberately into the stone, not a crack, not accidental, and disappeared downward. He submitted a written note to the diocese, describing what he had found and asking for guidance on how to handle the wire during the roof repairs. The diocese's response, which arrived 10 days later, instructed him to leave the wire entirely undisturbed in the course of his work and to make no record of it in the repair schedule. The response is in his working file for the Ottery St. Mary project. His working file is in the Devon Heritage Center in Exeter, donated by his son in 1952. Buller did not make a record of the wire in the repair schedule. He made a record of it in his personal site notebook, which is in the same donation. The Diocese of Exeter's repair authorization for the St. Mary's Nave Roof project, which is in the Devon Heritage Center under a diocesan record series, contains the standard elements of a church restoration commission, the scope of work, the agreed fees, the completion requirements. It does not mention the copper wire. The diocese's response to Buller's written note is in his personal file and not in any diocesan correspondence series. It exists in only one place, his file, because it was a response to a private inquiry he had made outside the official scope, and the diocese had apparently chosen not to enter it into its own records. The result is a diocesan instruction that the diocese itself has no record of having issued, to leave undisturbed a feature of an ancient church that the diocese itself has no record of knowing about. What that means, in practice, is that someone in the Diocese of Exeter in 1909 received a carpenter's note describing copper wire embedded in the fabric of a 14th century church and knew immediately not to ask what it was for, but to ensure it was preserved. That is not the response of an institution encountering something unexpected. That is the response of an institution that already knew it was there. Buller was not a man who startled at unusual details in old buildings. He had spent 28 years finding things in church roofs and walls that were not on any plan and had no documentary explanation. Mason's marks, votive deposits, structural adaptations of unknown purpose. The capacity to encounter the unexplained without distorting it was, for him, a professional necessity. What he described in his site notebook was not wonder. It was careful observation, He noted the gauge of the wire, which he estimated at approximately 16 thousandths of an inch, thin, consistent with low-resistance transmission rather than power carrying. He noted the quality of the insulating cloth, which he described as better than anything in current trade use in 1909 for exterior electrical work. He noted that the wire was continuous. He saw no joints, no splices, no repairs along the entire length he was able to trace. And he noted that it was old. Not old in the way that a Victorian gas fitting is old. Old in the way that the tie beams themselves were old, worked in during original construction, or as near to it as the evidence allowed him to judge. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Edwin Buller found in the roof of St. Mary's Ottery, we have to go back, not just to the medieval church as an architectural form, and not just to the craftsmen who built it. We have to go back to a question that the official history of ecclesiastical architecture has never asked in any published forum: what the copper installations found in medieval English churches were designed to do, who designed them, and why the institutional church, the Church of England, the diocesan fabric committees, the cathedral chapters, has consistently treated the discovery of those installations as something to be noted privately, preserved carefully, and never entered into any public account of the buildings that contain them. The official history of church fabric presents medieval English churches as buildings whose structural and decorative elements are reasonably well understood. The liturgical function of each architectural feature is catalogued. Building techniques are studied and mapped. What this account does not address is the structural metalwork, not the decorative screens and lecterns, but the copper and bronze elements embedded in the masonry and timber at the time of construction, connected to each other by wire or rod runs that the official architectural record has never traced and whose function the official history of church architecture has never described. These elements exist in a significant proportion of medieval English parish churches. They have been found and noted by restoration workers for at least a century and a half, and in every documented case, the institutional response has been the same as the Diocese of Exeter's response to Edwin Buller: preserve it, make no record of it in the official documentation, and do not ask what it is for. An architect named Herbert Spence, who worked on Anglican church restoration projects across the East Midlands from 1883 to 1921, kept a detailed professional diary in which he recorded every significant discovery he made in the buildings he worked on. The diary, donated by his family to the Lincolnshire Archives in 1944, runs to 4 volumes. In 11 separate entries across his career, Spence records the discovery of copper or bronze wire installations embedded in church fabric, wall plates, roof timbers, stone courses. In 3 of those 11 entries, he describes tracing the wire installations sufficiently to establish that they formed continuous circuits, complete loops that began and ended at the same point in the building, passing through the stonework of the walls, the timber of the roof, and in 2 cases descending into the floor, where their lower terminations were not accessible to him without breaking the floor surface. He noted in his entry for a church in Rutland in 1896 that the circuit he had traced ran along the entire perimeter of the nave at wall plate level, descended at each of the 4 corners of the nave into the floor, and appeared from the angle of descent at each corner to be directed toward the center of the building rather than toward the exterior foundations. He wrote, "The circuit, if completed below floor level, would form a closed system centered on the nave. I do not know what such a system would do. I know what it resembles. It resembles a coil." He submitted no formal report on the discovery to the church's restoration committee. He noted it in his diary and moved on. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the copper wire installations found in medieval English churches are not random survivals of a decorative or protective practice, but elements of a design system whose function was consistent across a significant number of buildings spanning several centuries of construction. The circuits that Herbert Spence traced in Rutland in 1896, perimeter loops at wall plate level, descending at corners toward a central point, match the wire configurations found in pre-Reformation continental churches, documented by a German architectural historian named Klaus Mertens in a 1938 monograph on Rhineland church fabric, which described identical copper installations in 14 Rhineland churches of 12th and 13th century construction. Mertens's monograph was published in a limited run of 80 copies in Cologne in 1938 and has not been cited in any English-language architectural history. A copy is held in the British Library under a German architectural monograph succession. Mertens proposed that the wire installations were part of a system designed to concentrate and direct atmospheric electrical potential within the building's enclosed space to make the interior of the church electrically different from its exterior. He did not specify for what purpose. He wrote only that the system, if functional, would produce an interior environment that was measurably distinct from its surroundings in ways that the human nervous system would register without necessarily identifying. Norfolk, 1891, a church restoration builder named Thomas Crane, working on the nave of St. Peter Mancroft in Norwich, found copper wire wound around the base of every principal rafter in the roof, 27 rafters, each identically wound, each connected to a continuous run of wire along the south wall plate. Crane's work diary, held at the Norfolk Record Office, records the discovery and his attempt to trace the wire's termination. He followed the south wall plate run to the point where it descended into the stonework of the south wall and lost it. He found no termination point anywhere accessible in the building fabric. He reported the discovery to the church's restoration committee, who referred it to the diocese. The diocese's response, in the committee's minutes, instructed that the wire was to be left undisturbed in the course of all further restoration work. The minutes are in the Norfolk Record Office. The instruction is in them. The reason is not. Dorset, 1903, an architect named William Farley, undertaking a quinquennial inspection of St. Martin's Church in Wareham, noted in his inspection report a section of the north chancel wall where lime render had fallen away to expose a course of dressed stone, and in that stone course a lead-covered copper rod running horizontally for approximately 4 feet before disappearing at both ends into intact stonework. The rod was approximately ½ an inch in diameter. Farley photographed it and described it in his inspection report as an unusual structural element of uncertain date and purpose, recommending further investigation. The inspection report is in the Dorset History Center. The diocese's response to Farley's recommendation, also in the Dorset History Center, states that the element had been noted in a previous inspection and that no investigation was required. A previous inspection had noted it. That means the diocese already knew. Farley's inspection report is the second notation of a feature the diocese was apparently tracking across multiple inspection cycles without ever adding it to any public record of the building. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. But here is what makes Edwin Buller's site notebook different from every other account of copper wire installations in English churches. In 1951, 42 years after Buller traced the wire in the Ottery St. Mary roof space, the same church underwent a more extensive restoration under an architect named Roger Fenn, who was commissioned by the diocese to address deterioration in the nave and north aisle. Fenn had no knowledge of Buller's 1909 work notebook or of the copper wire Buller had found. He was given the diocese's repair authorization for the 1909 project, which contained no mention of the wire. On his second day in the roof space, he found it. He found it exactly where Buller had found it 42 years earlier, wound around the rafter base, running along the wall plate, disappearing into the north wall stonework. He noted it in his own site report with a sketch and a measurement. He traced it to the same point Buller had reached. He asked the diocese for guidance. The diocese response, sent within 5 days, which was fast for a diocesan administrative communication in 1951, instructed him to leave the wire undisturbed and to omit it from his repair schedule. Fenn's site report, with its sketch of the wire, is in the Devon Heritage Center. The diocese's instruction to him is in the same file. Both are accessible. What they establish, read beside Buller's 1909 notebook, is that the same institution issued the same instruction in response to the same discovery in the same church, 42 years apart, to 2 different architects who had no knowledge of each other's findings. The diocese knew about the wire in 1909. The diocese knew about it in 1951. In neither case did the diocese explain what it was, record what it was, or permit the man who found it to include it in his official documentation of the building. The Diocese of Exeter has never adequately addressed several specific questions about the copper wire installation in St. Mary's Ottery. It has never explained why its 1909 response to Buller's inquiry, an instruction to leave the wire undisturbed, exists in his private file, but not in any diocesan correspondence series. It is never explained how its 1951 response to Fenn, which instructs identical preservation of the same wire, was issued within 5 days of his report if the diocese had no institutional knowledge of the wire's existence. It is never explained what Herbert Spence's 1896 diary entry describes when it records a closed copper circuit at nave wall plate level, descending at each corner toward the center of the building, and notes that the configuration resembles a coil. Why does the diocese preserve a feature it will not document? Why does Thomas Crane's Restoration Committee receive an instruction to leave copper wire undisturbed without any reason being given, and accept it, and minute it, and proceed? Why does a diocesan response acknowledging a wire installation in a church fabric arrive in 5 days if the institution receiving the discovery report has no prior knowledge of what was found? Why does an institution that has not recorded knowing about something respond as if it always has? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we have are a carpenter's site notebook in Devon, an architect's professional diary in Lincolnshire, a work diary in Norfolk, an inspection report with a previous inspection reference in Dorset, a German monograph on 80-copy print run describing identical installations in 14 Rhineland churches, and 2 diocesan instructions, 42 years apart, to leave the same wire undisturbed in the same building, and a pattern of institutional response that, across the Church of England, multiple dioceses, and a century of church restoration work, treated embedded copper wire as something to be preserved through oral instruction and deliberate omission from the written record, rather than documented, investigated, or explained. For the remaining 18 years of his career after the Ottery St. Mary project, Edwin Buller continued working on church fabric across Devon and Somerset. He found copper wire installations in 3 more churches. Each time he notified the relevant diocese. Each time, the response was a preservation instruction with no explanation. He noted all 3 in his personal site notebooks, which are all in the Devon Heritage Center donation. In the last of the 3 notebooks, from a church in Somerset in 1924, he wrote a sentence in the margin beside his wire notation that he had not written before. He wrote, "This is the 4th time. The answer is the same each time. They know what it is. They have decided I should not." He had spent 28 years restoring the fabric of buildings that the Church of England administered, and in that time he had found, repeatedly, a feature of those buildings that the church preserved with deliberate care and refused to explain with equal deliberateness. He was a craftsman. He noted what he found. He wrote, at the end of his working life, the conclusion his evidence had earned. They know what it is. They have decided I should not. The wire is still in that roof. St. Mary's Ottery stands today in Devon, as it has stood for 7 centuries, its nave roof intact, its north wall plate running east toward the stonework, where the wire disappears. If you were to enter the roof space today, as Edwin Buller did in 1909 and Roger Fenn did in 1951, you would find it in the same place they found it. Wound around the rafter base, continuous, insulated in cloth, that has now had a further 70 years to harden. The Devon Heritage Center holds both notebooks. The 2 diocesan instructions are in both files. The wire connects them, 42 years apart, through a building that has been standing for 7 centuries and through an institution that has known about the wire for at least as long as either man was alive and has never, once, in any document accessible to any researcher, said what it is. The official history of the medieval English parish church tells us that these buildings were designed for prayer, for community, for the liturgical calendar of a faith. What the restoration workers' notebooks tell us, from Devon to Lincolnshire to Norfolk to Dorset, across 40 years of independent discoveries by men who had no knowledge of each other's work, is that the buildings they were restoring contained something the faith that administers them has never put into a document and has never allowed to be removed. Copper circuits at wall plate level, closed loops descending toward the center, wire so continuous and so old that a man who had spent a career working with old timber called it part of the original installation. Whatever those circuits were doing in those buildings for 7 centuries, the church was not ready for anyone to find out. It still isn't. These records survive because people refuse to stop looking. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is wound into a rafter. It disappears when no one is allowed to write it down. Next week, I am following a thread that connects Edwin Buller's wire to a faculty petition filed with the Diocese of Salisbury in 1887 by the vicar of a Wiltshire parish church, requesting permission to remove what he described as a metal installation discovered during nave floor relaying, which he believed to be a pagan remnant inconsistent with Christian worship. The diocese's response denied the faculty on the grounds that the installation was a protected structural element of the building. A faculty petition in the Church of England requires a bishop's approval to alter a listed fabric element. The Diocese of Salisbury in 1887 classified a metal installation of unknown origin in a parish church floor as a protected structural element, which means someone had already decided it needed protecting. The faculty petition is in the Wiltshire History Center. The diocese's denial is in it. The installation is still in that floor.